Hi, Joseph.
Oh, hi. Hi, Will.
How you doing today?
I'm okay.
Well, great. Well, thanks for coming on Blogging Heads TV. My name is Will Wilkinson. I'm a research fellow at the Cato Institute. And why don't you introduce yourself?
So my name is Joseph Heath. I'm a professor in the philosophy department at the University of Toronto.
Excellent. We are going to talk about your book today, Joseph. It's called... when does it come out?
It's coming out on April 10th, 2009.
April 10th.
Next weekend.
So it'll probably be out by the time Blogging Heads viewers are watching this. It's called Filthy Lucre, Economics for People Who Hate Capitalism.
That's right. I should mention, by the way, it's coming out in Canada. I haven't sold it in the United States yet. Apparently,
you haven't sold it?
Apparently there's a lack of people who hate capitalism in the United States. So I'm told.
No, it's not true. It's not true. That's amazing that you haven't sold it. Well, hopefully somebody will be watching and want to buy your rights. It's a great book, and it would be great. There's a lot of Americans who, if they don't hate capitalism, they misunderstand it, and I think your book is helpful.
Well, thanks.
So let's talk a little bit about what led you to read this book. Write this book. You're a philosophy professor at the University of Toronto. Let's say something about some of the books that you've read. I'm familiar with you from your book with, I forget the guy's name, Potter.
Andrew Potter, yeah.
Yeah, Rebel Cell, as it was called in Canada at least, which was kind of a, anti-no logo book or something like that. What got you into thinking about economics as a philosophy professor?
Well, actually, all these books are kind of why everything I used to believe turned out to be wrong books. So Rebel Cell was like why all the countercultural stuff I learned from my hippie parents turned out to be wrong. And then this book is sort of like why a lot of the economics I learned from my left-wing professors turned out to be wrong. But part of it is just as a philosopher, I'm really interested in fallacies, and I kind of like when something seems obvious and then you look at it more carefully and it turns out it's not so obvious. And that's actually one of the hooks that gets you into philosophy, where you think, oh, there's an external world, and then some professor gets up and shows you that how can you possibly know that, right? And the usual philosophy fallacies have been mined pretty carefully. People know how they work. But economics is just a minefield of fallacies, and over time I've been impressed. I mean, not only at mistakes in my own thinking, but just how many highly educated people I talk to who make absolutely flagrant errors of economic reasoning, and how the economics profession hasn't done kind of a good enough job at bringing economic literacy to the masses. So that people just make mistakes, and economics is tricky. I admit. I mean, I don't believe you have to have 3 years of calculus before you can understand basic stuff. But I do think that it's a tricky subject, and it's really easy to make mistakes. Actually, I'm waiting for a bunch of economists to read this book and point out 20 economic fallacies in the stuff that I've written too.
Yeah, well, it's a complicated subject matter, and and I had points where I was like, well, there's a study you need to read, my friend, or something like that. But it wasn't really about the basic logic of it. So the structure of the book is it's divided in half. There's the first half is economic fallacies of the right. The last half is economic fallacies of the left. Now, you said you came to this by realizing or coming to think that a lot of what you had been told is wrong. So I want to tell us a little bit more about that journey. So what were your politics when you were in college, and what would you say your politics are now?
Well, when I was an undergrad, so I was in the 80s, right? So right in the middle of the Cold War. And so you had the usual sort of choice of unappetizing alternatives. So you had capitalism and communism, the big two options. And like most people, I thought those two were unattractive, and so I was like floating around looking for alternatives to them. So I think when I was an undergrad, I described myself as an anarcho-syndicalist. But I think that itself was a symptom of sort of desperation, right? That is, what you wanted to be was neither into capitalism nor into communism because of its obvious defects. So there was a lot of hand waving about, some alternative that would involve spontaneous cooperation amongst producers and that kind of thing. I remember once, so during my peak anarchist phase, I worked as a computer programmer. I was working with this guy who went on to do a finance degree. Anyhow, so I was like giving him my big anarchist theory of how society should be organized, and he said, okay, well, but then who would be responsible for currency? I thought it was such a weird question, right? Because usually when you come across an anarchist, everyone's got these big questions like law and order and this kind of stuff. But he was like, who would be concerned about currency? I was like, I never crossed my mind. I was like, well, what a weird, dumb question. I don't know. Somebody would do that, right?
There'd be the currency cooperative.
Yeah, exactly.
And they would, like, in cooperation with all the other cooperatives, decide how much money to print.
Yeah. So I probably said something just like that. But the question stuck with me, partly because it was so specific as a question. It wasn't like a big picture question. It was very specific. Who's going to manage the currency? And I thought, gee, I guess we're going to have an answer to that question, right? Like, it's not enough to say, there was this very popular dodge, it still is popular to say, well, there is no blueprint for a free society, right? So that kind of stuff will be worked out after the revolution. But I was never really very satisfied with that. So it struck me as being a reasonable question, the kind of thing you should probably have an answer to. And the more I thought about it, the more it seemed just obvious to me that you're not going to get a good answer to that other than the state, and that lots of things followed from that. So, that was the beginning of the awakening. But, life is a long... I once described my intellectual trajectory as being like a very, very long, slow process of realizing that John Stuart Mill was right about pretty much everything.
I feel like we're kind of like bizarro versions of each other, because I've kind of come from I started with Ayn Rand, and then I went through an anarcho-capitalist phase where I'd argue with anybody about whether you could have the private provision of rights protection, and how you keep the private rights providers from devolving into gang war. You have these like very esoteric kind of theoretical conversations, and basically I've drifted into thinking that John Stuart Mill was right about most things. So
yeah, the political spectrum does bend around and meet at the back end. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think we're two people who probably agree on some form of mundane liberalism, but have a difference of emphasis. It probably just because of the prior probabilities that the path dependency of your beliefs tends to keep you stuck on some of the things that you used to believe. And so I'm going to defend some right-wing fallacies, and you can defend against them. But before we so the book goes right-wing fallacies and left-wing fallacies, but let's talk about left-wing fallacies first.
Sure.
Because I agree with most of what you say. I'm going to run them down real quickly. We won't be able to go over each one in detail. You go through the just price fallacy, learning to love the psychopath, which is why the profit motive's not so bad. Boom and bust, why the system isn't going to collapse under its own contradictions. Equal pay, why there are going to be sort of inequalities in wages and incomes, in any system that works. I'm poor and I know why capitalism produces so few capitalists, and leveling down. Some good ways and bad ways to promote equality. So those are your left-wing fallacies. What do you think is the most important of these? What's the biggest problem that you think people have on the left when it comes to economic literacy?
What's the uber fallacy? I would say two. The first is what gets called the overproduction fallacy, which is lurking in a lot of those. And so it's the idea that it's possible to have that crises and business cycles and so forth are produced by an excess of commodities. So it's just the old-fashioned Marxist idea that it's possible to have overproduction. That's a hugely pernicious fallacy, and it's what underlies the left-wing critique of consumerism and so forth. And fundamentally, that comes from a failure to appreciate that a market economy is a system of exchange, so that for everybody who sells something, there has to be somebody who buys something. So that's like a really central and pernicious fallacy. And then the second one has to do with profitability, and this idea that profit is a sort of moral pollution, and that it completely dominates the behavior of enterprises. That leads people just to kind of conflate the private sector with self-interest, and then the public sector with altruism. and therefore to imagine that a profit-oriented enterprise is basically allowing self-interest to rule, and that therefore get rid of profit, and all of a sudden peace and harmony will reign. That's totally wrong, totally pernicious fallacy. I don't think you're going to disagree on those, right? So.
No, I'm not going to talk about a little, because this always puzzled me. And again, so one of the books you mentioned at the beginning of your book that you thought was a good sort of primer in economics, Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. It's a great book, and you're also right. He is a cheerleader for free markets. Well, but that's the kind of book where I got my sort of fundamental sort of like economic intuitions formed. So reading books like that. And when I encountered people on the left, your Benjamin Barber or William Greider or Naomi Klein or somebody like that, and I'd hear these things about overconsumption and consumerism, and I was always completely baffled by it. So because my immediate thought is, well, if you produce too much, it's possible to produce too much of something. What happens is that there's an oversupply in the market, the price drops, and you sell it all off. The market clears, even if just for the whatever the scrap is worth, but you're not going to end up. There's no possibility of ending up with just stuff that you produce that simply rots sitting there, except in very, very unusual circumstances. So I was never and so there was always this idea that we produce too much, and then you've got all this stuff that you've produced, and you've got to go look around it. We don't have anybody to sell it to. We have to go conquer some third world country and open up their market so we can dump our goods on. And none of this, it was always very confusing to me. Can you actually explain what the thought is behind?
How it happened? Well, look, a lot of people in the 19th century thought that this was true. It was, Malthus was trying to work out some version of that. Marx presented just that view. Part of the problem, actually, it's sort of Keynes's fault. Unlike most things. And that is that Keynes has such a blistering attack on Say's law, right? So Say's law is just the claim that supply creates its own demand.
Yes.
And which is not totally true, but it's a good rule of thumb for understanding how market economy works. And namely, that every time somebody sells something, somebody has to buy something. So by default, supply and demand come to the same thing. Now, the problem with Say's law, it had the pernicious consequence of persuading people that, for example, depressions couldn't occur, mass unemployment couldn't occur, and so forth. And so Keynes was fighting such a massive uphill battle against a fairly ideologically rigid group of opponents who simply would not give up on Say's law, that there was a lot of rhetorical overkill in the general theory. And so he presented it as though he had shown Say's law to be false, absolutely false. And so a generation of leftists just took him on his word, and they said, right, Marx has this theory that presupposes the falsity of Say's law. Keynes come along and showed just that. Say's law is false. Therefore, the Marxist theory is back on, and we don't have to change anything. Well, that's a misinterpretation. What Keynes really actually showed was just that money makes things way more complicated and can significantly gum up the works. And so you can have a state of equilibrium in which there's mass unemployment and so forth. But I really do think that the rhetorical problem comes from the fact that people don't insist upon the fact that, by and large, under normal circumstances, Say's law is true. Yeah. And people on the left kind of have selective awareness of this, right? So they realize, for example, that there's no such thing as, like, immigration-induced unemployment. Right? So why is it that bringing immigrants in? Immigrants do take jobs, right? So why don't they take jobs away from people who are native-born? Well, it's because the same way they contribute to the supply of labor, they create additional demand for commodities. How much demand for commodities? Well, exactly the same amount as the additional supply of labor they've generated. Now, that's Say's law. And it's generally true. Assuming that money's working fine and that you're not in a recession or whatever, then, supply creates its own demand. But that, of course, is true across the economy. People have to realize the systematic consequences of that. Right? You invent like some new television, and you go out and sell it. You don't have to create the demand for it. So I really do actually think it's Keynes' fault. And one of the things I do throughout the book that's undoubtedly going to generate problems, though, is I talk though as though Say's law were true, because I think it's actually, even though I understand and grant the very very significant exception that is what's underlying all the mayhem going on right now in our economy. It's a major exception, But the point is that it's an exception to a rule which is otherwise true. And for everyday purposes, it's better to think of things as though Say's law were true. But Keynes created a whole intellectual culture in which people just by default treat it as though it were false.
Yeah. So, I mean, the real Keynesian insights come in terms of the timing of production and consumption, and that these things can get out of sync with one another because of a system of money and credit, right? The way production and consumption relate to one another is complicated.
Yeah, and also the investment spending has to expand in order to absorb shortfalls in consumer spending. And therefore it's important that the interest rates be regulated and the credit markets be functioning and so forth. Whereas the leftist diagnosis tends to focus entirely on consumer demand and to treat that as though it were effective demand. So they imagine that if workers get replaced by machines, that generates a shortfall in demand. Which is not true, right? If profits go up, then either people appropriate that, they spend it, or else they invest it in capital equipment or whatever. It gets spent somewhere, right? So, I mean, this is sort of the old-fashioned story that, again, you can assume that this is all going to work properly, assuming the monetary and the credit mechanism is functioning correctly.
Yeah.
That's why for
that is obviously not a small assumption, because a well-functioning monetary and credit system isn't something you get for free. It's a difficult institution.
That's right, and right now it's malfunctioning, and therefore we live in unusual times. The problem is that people have been treating the last 40 years as though it's all been, as though unusual times were in fact normal times.
Yeah.
And so that the capitalist system was in a perpetual state of overproduction, and so that we have these increasingly automated factories turning out increasingly large numbers of goods, and then we have desperate capitalists running around trying to find people to buy them, and then conspiring with Madison Avenue to create increasingly clever advertising campaigns to appeal to our subconscious to make us want them. And there's this whole story about consumerism and advertising and so forth, as though all of this infrastructure was put in place in order to solve the problem of overproduction and the shortfall of demand. And that is based on an absolutely elementary economic fallacy. But I have colleagues, I read stuff by very, very well-educated university professors who even go about trying to calculate what percentage shortfall of demand is chronic in a capitalist economy, which is just sort of crazy talk, right? There's no such thing.
Yeah.
Under normal
I find
circumstances.
It mysterious. I mean, but now, I think it's important to point out that now is should be the best time ever for that person. Because we do seem to have a recession that was in fact caused by a period of overconsumption, and the period of overconsumption was financed by a certain kind of easy credit, and the availability of that credit was heavily subsidized in various ways by the government. So it's not. So it's on the one hand, the argument that Madison Avenue and marketers are trying to make people want things so that they'll absorb this excess consumption is kind of crazy. It's definitely crazy. But the idea that we can have periods of overconsumption isn't crazy, because we just had one, and we're suffering from it. But I would say that the right answer the right way to diagnose that is that there's a miscoordination in the system, that people's consumption choices were distorted in various ways by incentives that were sort of out there. You could buy a house for cheap, you could get a loan for cheap, you could get a credit card really, really easily. All of these things were factors that people were responding reasonably to, and helped get us into big problems. But it's not that the capitalist economy produces too much. It was that people were spending money that they didn't have any prospect of having.
Yeah, and that there was excessive leverage and a variety of things like that. I mean, look, the current crisis has been obviously a huge boon to people in the kind of liberal center, and the Keynesians, the Paul Krugmans of the world. But the left, which exists to varying degrees in different countries, right? But the bona fide left has had amazingly little to say, and particularly the Marxist left and that sort of rump, has had amazingly little to say about the current crisis, simply because it's clearly financial and it doesn't relate to broader features of production or of the capitalist economy. And also it was, in its origin was highly localized in the American economy. But you still get people on the bona fide left sort of dogmatically trying to read this as a version of the old-fashioned crisis. So, I mean, I actually revised the book just as it was going to press to quote from this extraordinary op-ed piece that Richard Florida wrote. And I want to criticize him because now he's my colleague. He teaches at my university and he makes way more money than me. So I feel obliged to criticize him. But he wrote this column where he says, this looks like it's all about finance and about these complicated products and da-da-da-da, but actually it's not about that at all. It's actually about this Fordist mode of production, which has become dominant in industrial economies since the Second World War. And what's the problem with it? Well, it produces too many commodities. That's what it's really about. Now, like, how are you going to draw a connection between that and what's really going on? Sorry, not to be too prejudicial, but, I mean, to draw a connection between subprime mortgages and Fordism as being somehow, like, the real story of this, I mean, that's working really hard to preserve a very, very outmoded and sort of intellectually indefensible Marxist theory against reality, right, which is clearly that this had to do with financial structure, and it had to do with credit markets. Why are credit markets important? Well, the old leftist/Marxian explanation has no explanation for why credit matters.
So why does it matter? I mean, so what are they missing? Like, why can't we just go around? Why would I need? Because people become like slaves to this piece of plastic, right? You get yourself in debt. You spend a ton of money. Then you have to pay the creditor. You have to pay all this interest. You're working for them rather than yourself. Why shouldn't people just pay for whatever they want with the cash that they happen to have on hand? Or even barter. I've got some eggs, you've got some milk. Like, why do we need these fancy devices like credit in order to have a good society and a good economy? Why do we need it?
Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't even thinking about consumer credit. I was thinking of corporate and bank lending.
Okay.
Right. I mean, the reason that's important is
same problem writ large, though, right? So.
Yeah, but the reason that's important is that it's not a problem if consumers start spending less, as long as something else takes up the slack. In other words, as long as the resources get shifted into investment, and credit is the mechanism. Bank credit is the mechanism through which that happens. Right? That's why it's important. Is that consumer spending is not the whole economy. Business spending is hugely important as well.
So why do we? And you're right. It's much more important at the sort of macro level. So why do we need a system of credit for a well-functioning economy? Why can't I'm an entrepreneur? I want to start a business. Why can't I simply go out and find a bunch of partners and have them sort of team up with me? Like, why do I need to be able to get a loan from a bank in order to start a new company? Why do I need to be able? If I'm already a huge company, why do I need to take out billions of dollars in loans in order to start a new product line? I mean, why can't I just finance that myself?
Actually, that raises the that's connected to the issue of the moral status of profit, because when you go out, it is actually something of an illusion to think that when you go out on the stock market or you go to a venture capitalist or whatever, when you get equity funding, that there's some kind of huge difference between that and credit, bank credit. So in the discussion of profit, I pick up on this incredibly provocative idea, or more like a slogan, that Henry Hansman from the Yale Law School has suggested. He wrote this very, very influential book. I do business ethics as well, and this has been hugely influential in business ethics. He wrote a book called The Ownership of Enterprise. And what he does is he says that basically everything is a co-op, except for a non-profit, right? I mean, every form of enterprise is a co-op. We call it, when it's owned by the workers or the suppliers or the customers, we call it a co-op. But a standard business corporation itself is just a co-op as well. It's a lender's co-op, as opposed to being a workers' co-op. And there are a lot of co-ops around. So, for example, Visa is a supply co-op, so that the companies that supply the credit are the owners of the firm. A condominium is essentially a consumer's co-op. A law firm is basically a workers' co-op. So there are co-ops all around the economy. So he has this brilliant way of explaining why we should think of corporations as lenders' co-ops. And he uses this analogy of a dairy co-op, where the way a dairy co-op typically works is a bunch of farmers sell milk to the co-op, and they always sell it below the market rate in order to make sure that the co-op remains an ongoing concern. And then the co-op, whatever, pasteurizes, makes cheese, whatever. And then it takes all of the excess revenue and gives it back to all of the co-op members, usually prorated for the amount of milk that they've contributed. Well, what Hansman says is, to understand a business firm, basically think dairy co-op and substitute money for milk. Right? So the thought is, you always have to raise capital to have any kind of whatever ongoing significant investment. One way of doing it is to go to a bank and get it on contractual terms, just like you can go on the market and you can buy milk.
Yeah.
But another way to do is to get people who are willing to lend to you at below market rates. And that's what shareholders who buy, especially in an IPO, are essentially doing. They're lending money to the firm at a zero interest rate in order to make sure that the firm remains an ongoing concern. And what do they get in return? Well, they get a share of the product. And they get voting rights that are commensurate with the amount of money that they put on. So he has this brilliant thought that a corporation should be understood as being a lender's co-op, the same way that a dairy farm is a supply co-op. I find that incredibly helpful at sort of undemonizing. I mean, first of all, at understanding the difference between credit and equity, because a dairy co-op, you only want a certain number of members. So you'll have founding members, but then maybe when your prices are high and you want to buy extra milk, or maybe you want to buy eggs or something like that. Typically, you won't go out and bring in new members. You'll just go out and buy it on contractual terms at the market rate. And so the fact that you're getting milk from members doesn't mean you can't also buy milk on the market. Well, the same thing with a business enterprise. You get some capital from members in the form of equity, but that doesn't mean you can't go out on the market and purchase capital as well. When you go to a bank for a loan, you're essentially getting it on contractual terms. And every ongoing concern has a mix of debt to equity. I find that an incredibly helpful way of understanding
me too. That's great.
How business corporations work. I also find that incredibly helpful ideologically at sort of undemonizing profit, because nobody thinks there's anything wrong with cooperatives doing revenue sharing amongst their members. And so why should the business corporation be any different? The fact that, in the end we split up, that you have residual claimants, and that the money that's left over at the end of the day goes back to the members. Why? Because they're the ones who provided their input on preferential terms. They're the ones who made, in the case of a corporation, a zero-interest loan to the corporation. So naturally they should get a residual claim. I find that incredibly illuminating and helpful.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, that it's clear how that helps illuminate the profit motive, because you've sort of wiped out the distinction between these different kinds of organizations, but there's still this lingering issue that different kinds of institutions both require and reinforce a certain kind of motivation. And there's this idea on the left and the right that markets are really like talking to people's self-interest, that they're encouraging people to see things in their self-interest and to have this kind of instrumental view of rationality that kind of ignores how their individual economic behavior affects the public good. So tell me a little bit about your thinking about self-interest and motivation and how that affects people's view of capitalism and market economies.
Well, I think the first thing that should be axiomatic is that people, no matter where they work, are motivated by a mixture of altruism and egoism, by external incentives and internal incentives. And so people who work within large bureaucracy, working in a large bureaucracy is not that different, whether you're working in the public sector or the private. And the kinds of motives that you find are typically similar, the mix of motives that you find. And so the first thing about corporations is that, when the picture you get in business school is a little different from the picture you get in economics classes, right? Where it's only recently that the black box of the firm has been opened up, right? And so lots of people who are kind of study economics and want to go out in the business world, and so when they get there and they think it's going to be all this dog-eat-dog competition, and the first thing they get is like, some team building exercise where they have to play the trust game and fall into the arms of the person next to them, and there's all this kind of touchy-feely stuff, right? Or you look at, I remember picking up the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People because I wanted to become a more effective person. And I thought this was going to be sort of hard-nosed, total quality, whatever, right? And it's all this new age spirituality and discover your inner values.
That book is about how to be a Mormon.
Yeah. So I'm like, what on earth is this? And so the first thing about corporations that people need to understand is that they're cooperative enterprises. And so the better analogy for the market is that of team sports than some kind of state of nature. For the most part, most people who go out, most people aren't going to go out and start a business. Most people are going to work for a big bureaucracy. Now, the environment. So Ronald Coase famously described corporations as being like, what was it, like congealed lumps of butter in a pail of milk. And so I think that was it. Yeah. So
something like that.
The milk is the market, but fact is, most people find themselves inside a congealed lump of butter, namely a hierarchically organized bureaucracy. And they have problems of self-interest, but they also, corporations work overtime to try to build loyalty, especially with the influence of Japanese management techniques, but also in more knowledge-intensive sectors. I mean, it's really wrong to think of the employment contract as buying something off of somebody. So, I could sell you my used bike, or I could sell you 2 hours of my labor time. Like, I almost think a better way of thinking about salaries is that of bribing people to act cooperatively, or like bribing people to help you, or like giving people money in order to help you. But firms really are beholden to their employees to act cooperatively. Now, that's not true when you can have Taylorian management practices and you can monitor what person's doing minute by minute. But by and large, any kind of knowledge-intensive, information-rich environment, employers have no idea what their employees are doing most of the time. You rely upon a huge amount of voluntary cooperativeness on the part of employees. And the cheapest way to get that...
I work for a place in Washington, D.C. from Iowa. And the monitoring is not, intense, I'll tell you that.
I do this with my students, too. Like, I've been 15 years teaching at this university, I say. I've had exactly one of my lectures monitored once, and that was pre-tenure. University has no idea. No, there was a great case in Canada of a guy who sent his wife in to teach his lectures and didn't get caught until, I think, 6 or 7 years later. That was Professor so-and-so, right? I thought it was a he. Yeah. It turns out to be a she. There's very low monitoring, but that's kind of an exceptional case. But, right. I mean, firms. I mean, the reason all the Silicon Valley firms are.
It's important to be clear that if you work on an assembly line, it's different.
But think high tech. I mean, think of those Silicon Valley firms that are sending their, that are looking at the military and stuff like that for models, right? I mean, the military's got the biggest challenge. James Q. Wilson is great on this, right? Is that the military's got the greatest challenge because you have to motivate people to be willing to die, right? So you say to somebody, charge that machine gun nest. Like the very structure of the situation makes it difficult to incentivize that behavior, right? There you see the limits of external incentives. Hobbes said this, but nothing's going to motivate somebody to die, right? Well, other than virgins in paradise. But assuming this worldly incentives, right? So the military has to be all about internal incentives. It can't be about external incentives because you can't motivate people to charge machine gun nests with better pay. So it has to be about internal motivation. And, that's why a lot of firms look to the military, but also look to cults, look to all kinds of different models for how to motivate people, right? So these Silicon Valley firms, started famously sending people to boot camp and wilderness adventures and all this kind of stuff. It's all about building this team, esprit de corps, that kind of thing. So that's a hugely important part of how businesses actually function internally. And it's completely at variance with all this stuff about the competitiveness and the dog-eat-dogness of the market, which isn't to say that markets aren't competitive. It's just that those function as external constraints on firms. But what goes on internal to firms is all about what we take of as being normally pro-social, cooperative, altruistic forms of behavior.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's two levels at which markets are cooperative. I mean, so that's one, that internal to firms, that everybody has to be. These are cooperative enterprises. They can't. Kind of Coase's insight is that every little firm is like a little socialist economy that has to be centrally planned, and central planning is hard. You have to get, you never have enough information, yada yada. So you're going to have to get everybody, having a sense of solidarity, contributing things voluntarily. There's all sorts of incentive problems that you simply can't overcome when you're trying to centrally plan something with a set of external incentives. You can overcome some of them with these internal incentives, and that's why people are cooperative at all, in their workplaces. So firms are cooperative, but of course then trade is cooperative itself, right? The firm is producing a product, and the product is being sold, and the person buying the product wants the product more than they want the money, and vice versa. And so there's multiple levels of cooperativeness and pro-sociality in a market economy that sort of belies the idea that the whole thing runs on, devil take the hindmost, dog eat dog, competitive antagonism.
I agree with that, but it's important not to get too touchy-feely on it and to recognize that markets are a carefully staged competition. Right? So sometimes I complain a lot about this book, The Corporation by Joel Bakan, and there was a movie that came out that accompanied it, talking about as though having a corporation is just a license to seek profit at the expense of anything else, and that's absolutely not true. Corporations are licensed to seek profits in the very, very carefully staged circumstances of a reasonably competitive market economy. In cases where you cannot establish a functioning competition, firms are typically regulated, and the prices that they charge get set by the government, right? So it's only in the circumstances of a competitive market economy that firms are encouraged to seek profits. Why? Because so it is a competition, and there is something antisocial about that. The way team sports are kind of antisocial as well, right? Like, when you're playing hockey and the other team's down by 5 points, you can't start feeling bad for them, right? The natural human response is to feel bad for them and to start, giving them a chance or whatever, right? And good athletes don't feel that kind of sympathy for the person that they're crushing, right?
Yeah.
Well, similarly, corporations. So you open a business, you're going to feel bad about the guy across the street, know. So they are genuinely competitive, and we invest considerable energy and resources as a society making sure that they remain competitive. In the sense that, cartels don't develop and so forth.
Yeah.
But, that competition is, in fact, a prisoner's dilemma. It's a collective action problem, namely that it is not in the interests of firms to engage in price competition. So what firms sometimes describe as commodity hell is precisely when you have more or less the conditions of a competitive market that are achieved, which is that you don't have product differentiation and you have multiple firms and known technology, and then your profits disappear, right? Why? That's the whole point of the market economy, right, is to have markets.
Because the consumer is eating the surplus, and so that's part of the point that the point of the competition is that the competitors are competing to offer better terms of cooperation to consumers. So I was noticing the other day on television here, there was a local pharmacy that was offering $3 for their whole set of generic drugs. Why are they offering $3 for all their generics? Because a couple years ago, Wal-Mart started offering all of the generics for $4.
Right.
Now this has to have cut into the profit margin of this local pharmacy massively. But if they wanted to stay in business at all, they had to undercut Walmart, or else they would have, just disappeared. And this is what happened. This is the effect that Walmart had on groceries as well. The profit margins of all of the other producers basically disappeared as they started cutting prices in order to match Walmart. That's just consumers internalizing that surplus, and that's why places like Walmart tend to be disproportionately good for poor people who spend a larger amount of their money, say, on groceries. And it's especially good if once you start this sort of race to the bottom price competition on generic drugs, right? That's good for people who are sick. So the competition, there is this cutthroat competition, but the competition is to offer consumers better terms of cooperation, and that's why we want to stage that competition in that way.
Yeah, I actually have a soft spot for Walmart, which is not a good way of ingratiating yourself with the left in Canada. But it's a little easier to be a fan of Walmart in Canada because we have universal health care, and so the issue of health benefits for employees is a non-issue, right? And that makes it, like I said, a lot easier to be keen on Walmart. So what I typically say is that I have a lot of support for their business model, if not necessarily their business practices. Why? Because Walmart is actually doing the one thing that capitalist firms are supposed to be doing, which is competing aggressively on price. And there are lots of. While other firms are busy competing, branding and doing all kinds of other junk, right? Walmart's doing the thing which you're supposed to do, which is you're supposed to run the ship as efficiently as possible, so you can deliver the goods as cheaply as possible. And I back when I used to write a newspaper column, I kind of issued a challenge to the leader of the Social Democratic Party here in Canada to kind of go and walk around a Walmart and ask yourself who's shopping there. Because the people who shop at Walmart are supposedly the natural constituency for the left. That may not be so true in the southern United States, but it's certainly true in Canada, right? You go to Walmart, and what you've got are recent immigrants, senior citizens, single mothers, this kind of thing. Those are the people. It's the economically disadvantaged and marginalized who are shopping at Walmart and not voting for social democratic parties. So I think social democratic parties need to do a little bit of the math and figure out, where their voters are and why. But Walmart, when it came into Canada, obviously had a huge impact and measurable impact on the quality of life of the poor. Not just because they directly sold merchandise at lower prices, but because of the competitive effects that they had, lowering prices all over the place. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for people who complain about Walmart. They did the same thing in Canada, like using putting very, very low prescription fees, for example, to attract senior citizens to come shopping there. The thought being, senior citizens, they're only going to go out once a week. They have to go out to get their prescriptions filled. So you give them this huge break on getting their prescriptions filled, and they're likely to pick up everything else that they need while they're there, right? I think that's that's great. Great business model. Everybody else should be doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've spent enough time, I used more time than I wanted to on the left, but we already got to some of it. So let's talk about fallacies on the right. What do you think is, because you sound way too soft on capitalism right now to the left-leaning listeners, so tell me a little bit about, tell me the worst fallacy that you see on the right.
The worst fallacy. Well, I was going to say, there's one that follows pretty immediately from, I think the right is just very, very confused about the state and what the, what the state can do well and what it can't do well. Connecting up with this discussion of Coase and market, the difference between the sort of cooperative behavior inside corporations and then the competitiveness of the market. I think that Coase's view of the corporation. There's this fundamental question: why are there corporations? If markets are so awesome, if you take a lot of this kind of unbridled rhetoric in support of the free market, and markets sound like they're just the greatest thing since sliced bread, Coase actually asked a kind of important and interesting question, which is, well, if markets are so fabulous, why are there all these bureaucracies around? Because if you look at every large corporation, it's not a market. Managers aren't buying and selling things back and forth. Sometimes you simulate markets internally and so forth, right? But really, it's a giant bureaucracy, right? So if markets are so fabulous, why are there all these bureaucracies? And then the answer is transaction costs and the advantages of hierarchy. Well, if you buy that story as an account of why there are corporations, it seems to me that you basically buy the story about why there's the welfare state and why we've seen the growth of state spending as a percentage of GDP from 0 to, in most countries, most industrialized Western countries, around 40% of GDP. That rise of the welfare state is explained by exactly the same story and exactly the same theory that Coase used to explain the rise of the corporation, which is the state is more efficient.
So the state is more efficient at providing what kinds of goods in your account?
I was going to say, and I always have to make an exception, right? Because especially when speaking to our friends from the South, that is, to say that the state is efficient is not to say that the American state is efficient. But there are states which are capable of being quite efficient. One of the things that Americans sometimes don't realize is that not only does the United States, in terms of just organizational culture in the state, responding to hurricanes and stuff like that. There are obviously efficiency challenges in the American state. But also, in the American state levies terribly inefficient taxes. Like the tax regime in the United States is incredibly inefficient. There are extremely high rates of corporate taxation, some of the highest in the Western world, in the United States, right? So the land of liberty actually, partly because your taxes are low, you can afford to be super inefficient, right? When you start getting a sophisticated modern welfare state, you then start pushing tax rates up to the point where they're, significant, right? Then you can't have heinously inefficient things like sales taxes. Then you start needing to have low rates of corporate taxation. You need to start having value-added taxes and so forth, which is why the Scandinavian countries have more efficient tax regimes, why Canada has a more efficient tax regime than the United States.
You mentioned this research. One of my favorite books in the last several years by Peter Lindert. And it's fascinating. It just shows that there are lots of degrees of freedom for governments to move in, and that you can have one set of inefficiencies or another set of inefficiencies. And if you're going to have a huge amount of social spending that are going to create, inefficiencies through the tax structure, you're going to have really, like flexible labor markets, good trade policy, well-structured tax policy elsewhere, because it is a surprising fact for people to find out that a country like Denmark or Sweden that has a level of spending as a percentage of GDP that's much higher than the U.S. has the same level of economic growth, more or less, over the last half century or so. And that's just surprising to people. But one of the things that's also surprising to people is that Denmark is just Hong Kong with a giant social insurance scheme.
Right.
And it's actually true. Like if you look at the there's these economic these indexes of economic freedom. And now one of the variables, like the tax rate gets kind of measured twice. So there's like percentage of spending. Spending is a percentage of GDP. And then there's also personal income tax rates. And those are highly correlated. So Denmark gets hit for both of those things pretty hard, which puts them down to like something like 14 or 15 in the economic freedom rankings.
Right.
But if you take out the just the size of government and tax rates, and you just look at everything else, Denmark has a greater level of economic freedom than Hong Kong.
Right.
It really does. That's crazy.
Well,
given the normal narrative about the socialist, Scandinavians, and similarly, Canada has got a higher level of economic freedom than the United States does. Once if you control for just that variable about spending or taxation, and on every other dimension, pretty much, the Canadian system has a higher level of economic freedom, given the way this is defined in these indices. And so what you do find that if a place has a high level of social spending, they offset whatever inefficiencies that causes with, they find efficiencies elsewhere.
And what I think is, like you, I like the Lindert story a lot. And one of the things I really love about it is the fact that his suggestion is that things work backwards. It's the fact that you get a huge state forces you to kind of clean up your act. And so what happens in the United States is you've got a relatively inefficient and ineffective government that consumes a relatively low percentage. That's the wrong way of putting it, but whose spending amounts to a relatively low percentage of GDP. And Americans, I think, quite reasonably look at that and they say, "Oh my God, you want to make this thing bigger? That's crazy." But the fact is, if you made it bigger, it would probably have to clean up its act in a lot of different ways. Why? Because you can't support that kind of bigness with the kind of tax code you guys have. I mean, I lived in Chicago for 5 years. I've had to fill out, American income tax forms. And
it's ridiculous.
It's enough to turn anybody off government, right? I mean, the Canadian forms are way better. Why? Because they're taking a much, much larger percentage of your income, and so your incentive to evade your taxes is that much greater. So if they hand you a form that's anything more complicated than a 1040 EZ, people just aren't going to do their taxes.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things that Lindert, I think, points out well is that it's not the size of government exactly. It largely has to do with the composition of spending. So, as you point out, that there's a sense in which, and I would criticize taking the analogy too far. There's a sense in which you can see a state as a big club that provides goods to its members. And I think the idea of, nation states as clubs who have members is actually sort of a pernicious idea at some level. But you can look at it that way. If the national club is providing goods that people want, then hey, that's great, right? That's phenomenal. If they really are just wasting a huge amount of money, then that's not so good. And the American government, the U.S. government, spends a giant amount of money on defense. It's an enormous part of the budget. And if we could do the amount of social insurance in the United States could double or triple if you just cut the military budget in half. So some of it just has to do with where you are doing the spending, what the composition of your spending is, not how much you're spending, and partly because the U.S. isn't constrained in these other ways in terms of having lavish entitlement systems. It's free to spend a huge amount of money on defense, but that gets you into all sorts of other complicated things. Arguably, the United States is subsidizing Canada's defense. Arguably, the United States is, subsidizing all of Western Europe's defense. It's not clear to me, even if that's true, it's not clear to me why we ought to be providing those public goods to, half of the world. But when you start to see the system as a global system, you might see that the composition of American spending has to do with the kind of goods it's providing, and it's actually providing some like global public goods that really the benefits aren't really internalized primarily by their own taxpayers.
Yeah, no, I agree. Canada, there's absolutely no question Canada gets a free ride off of American defense spending. But it's an odd thing of the conservative mentality. I mean, you talk to more American Republicans than I do, probably. I wonder, like,
sure,
if the United States had a healthcare system that was giving free health care to, like, foreigners all over the planet, you'd think that people wouldn't be so keen on it. But the American military spending does have that feature, right? There's no question that it's not just Canada. But, Europeans as well. I mean, they would have to spend a lot more on their military if the United States wasn't doing it. That, it seems to me, is a good argument for reducing American military spending. But American
conservatives love that. They love that we provide this global. I mean, like if there's this idea if we weren't doing it, we would be in danger.
Well, there's also the thought that America gets benefits from it, so that the look, if there's one big shipping firm that it's worth their while to provide the lighthouse, then go ahead, they provide the lighthouse. The fact that other ships benefit doesn't matter. So typically the thought is that the United States benefits sufficiently from its military, access to oil, that kind of stuff, that it doesn't matter that much that there is this fringe benefit. I think that's kind of dubious.
Well, I mean, it is true that if you have a huge volume of trade, which the U.S. has a larger volume of trade than any other country in the world, you've got a huge interest in keeping sort of international sort of trading lanes open.
Yeah, although Germany is far more dependent on trade as a percentage of GDP than the United States. But the thing is, I mean, one of the things about the military also, it's a little bit misleading because, as an example, because one of the fallacies that I'm at some pains to debunk in the book is this fallacy that the government is somehow a consumer. And the thought is that we have this picture of the private sector produces wealth and then the government eats it, or that it's and I think that one of the reasons I adopt this sort of club of everyone model of the government. I mean, I'm very much influenced by this little book that Joseph Stiglitz wrote called The Economic Role of the State, where he says that the state basically has two institutional features that give it comparative advantage when it comes to transaction costs, namely that membership in it is universal and mandatory. And so that's the one thing the state has that business firms don't have, which is that people can quit, the business firms, right? And that the state...
And, strictly speaking, as like a moral philosopher, membership isn't universal, right? Like,
universal in the territory.
The membership is... I mean, it's tautologist. All the members are members.
Yeah, mandatory is the big one.
So people with American citizenships are American citizens. Yeah.
Yeah. But so market failure is all about free rider problems, right? I mean, markets resolve a huge number of free rider problems, but they leave certain other ones unresolved. And corporations then come along and resolve a bunch of other ones. But then there are some that are really recalcitrant, like some people free ride in ways that are very, very difficult to get rid of. And therefore you need to have that universal mandatory, universal within the scope of the territory, and mandatory constraint, and only the state can deliver that. So the state is kind of like, you can think of often as the eliminator of free rider problems of last resort. So that's why I think this club of everyone model is useful for the way of thinking about the government. It's the one institution in which everyone is a member, and that's the best approach to thinking about it. So there's no difference, therefore, there's no difference in principle between a private individual in a market, a corporation, and a government. Neither of them are producers or consumers. It's just people are producers and people are consumers, and we have different ways of mediating the transactions. Markets. Old-fashioned private property is one way of organizing a transaction. A corporation working for a firm is another way of mediating that transaction. And then paying taxes, receiving benefits from the government is a different way of mediating the transaction. And often it's exactly the same good that's being exchanged. So when you think of private security, you may pay out of pocket for private security. You might live in a condominium where you've got some guy at the front desk who's collectively purchased security by members of the club, or you may you may call the police. Right, and that's just security purchased by the club of everyone.
Yeah. Now, well, I mean, you do emphasize that membership is mandatory, that you don't get to, and that I mean, because I think this is one problem that I had when so you mentioned one of my heroes, James Buchanan, and his theory of club goods, but you sort of didn't kind of go on to his thinking about the way democracy works in general, because it's true that like you can envision the government as providing certain kinds of goods to all of its members, the club of everyone, but in non-mandatory clubs, people get to choose what club they're a member of. They don't get to do that. So if you're a member of the club of everyone, you're going to pay your dues no matter what. whether or not you want what's provided or not. And the game and when the decision procedure that determines what the government provides is a democratic one, and you've got constituencies of people who want the government to be providing very different goods, there's a limited budget, different people want different goods, that game is a game of conflict. Right, so the game of politics is a game of conflict when people are where people are fighting over how to dispose of the membership dues because they're all stuck with whatever it gets spent on, and so I think you risk giving a sort of overly prettified view of the democratic process, which is a game of conflict when you just put it on this model of like a condominium association or something.
Right. Well, I guess three things to say. First of all, the democratic process works very differently in different countries, and different countries have experimented with different ways of finessing that problem. And so for example, like the problem of earmarks and rent seeking and so on, which is obviously huge in American government, is not a problem in any other industrial democracy. Right. So some of these things are artifacts of particular domestic political institutions, not democracy.
You mean earmarks, not rent seeking in general, because rent seeking in general is.
Rent-seeking in general is a problem, but earmarks, but also the existence of horse trading and so forth. I mean, it's the lack of party discipline in Congress that is a rather peculiar American political arrangement, which is typically not reproduced, that generates a particular form of rent-seeking behavior that actually gets a little out of control. No one's going to deny that, right? So it's important to distinguish, though, what democracy does from what American political institutions do. The second thing, I mean, with the lack of consumer choice in government, which I think, granted, there, is actually a point where the rubber hits the road between libertarians and welfarists. Actually, I mean, a big question becomes then, really, how much do you care about individual liberty versus how much do you care about social welfare? And if you're more concerned about liberty, then that's going to get up your nose in a much more significant way than if you're primarily concerned with social welfare. I gravitate more towards social welfare, so it doesn't bug me that much that I don't have as much choice. But then the final thing to say is that, look, it's all a matter of balancing the efficiency gains of having something produced and provided inefficiently, but with tons of consumer choice, versus having it provided more efficiently but with less choice. So you can buy your own exercise equipment, and that's relatively inefficient. You get all the consumer choice you want in the world, but it's kind of inefficient because the things just sit in your basement unused. Yeah. Or you can join a gym. And joining a gym, there's no question that limits your consumer choice. It's more efficient, right? Because then you share the Stairmaster with hundreds of other people, and it's way cheaper, so there's the efficiency gain. But it limits your choice. And if you go around gyms and you look at different, what they have available, there's some variety, but there's not the same kind of variety you get as an individual consumer in the market. And then you go to, I don't know, like, government supplied, whatever. They don't exist, right? But, if you went to the club of everyone, the gym that everyone had to join, then there would be even less choice. But I think it's really easy.
And it would suck.
I think it's easy to overstate the amount of choice which is available in markets. And I think it's also easy to understate the amount of choice that's available in government. Federalism in particular provides, non-trivial levels of consumer choice, especially in a highly mobile society like the United States, where you can move from state to state, right? So if you want to, send your kids to state school for university, don't go to South Carolina, go to California, right? Or and taxation rates. I mean, for a while, the lowest tax rates in a Canadian province, which was Alberta, were lower than the highest tax rates in the United States, which I think were in New York City. So even though Canada has socialized medicine and has a more generous welfare state, there are low tax regions of Canada. A lot of that's just free oil, right? Same as Alaska. But there are also within the United States surprisingly high tax areas of that city, and people make choices about where to live. So it's not like you get a one-size-fits-all package in all circumstances with the state. But so those are just trade-offs, and I think that just a straight-up efficiency perspective on it and allowing consumer choice to determine what the right mix is the right approach. And the way the state typically resolves it is by providing the good at a very low level and then allowing people to purchase extra if they want to. So you get particularly with insurance, right? When the state provides insurance, you get like bare bones insurance from the state, and you can buy more if you want. Like security as well. You get bare bones security from the state, namely the police, and then you can buy more if you want. But often that kind of multi-tier delivery of services is not only is the most efficient, but also does a reasonable job at preserving consumer choice.
So what else is wrong with the right? We've got a couple more minutes. I'll let you get in your last. What fallacy would you like the right to get over?
I have a chapter on personal responsibility because that's a big deal on the right. That the left kind of doesn't engage with it because a lot of people on the liberal left, they can't believe they don't understand how people on the right could possibly conceive of themselves as being morally superior to people on the left. They just can't picture it, right? Like, especially if you read like Ayn Rand or whatever, who just says, "Oh, it's all about egoism," and those other suckers are altruists, and those of us who are egoists, we support capitalism. I mean, if people on the left love Ayn Rand because it's the most unflattering picture you could have of the sort of Republican right. So people on the left have trouble picturing. They just think, oh, people on the right, they're self-interested, they're egoists. How could they possibly think they're morally superior to us? The answer often lies in this personal responsibility idea, which is that by getting people to kind of internalize the cost of their choices, you're promoting personal responsibility, and that's a moral imperative. So that's one of the things I tackle is this idea of personal responsibility. What I argue is that really what's going on in all these cases are moral hazard problems. I mean, not to get, I explain in the book the lingo, right? But that basically, whenever you have some kind of risk pooling arrangement, whenever you have some kind of insurance scheme, you're going to have moral hazard. And markets do a reasonable job at resolving certain kinds of moral hazard problems within risk pooling schemes. So we have insurance for simple stuff like automobiles and houses. But that there are many types of insurance that we desperately need where we can derive huge collective benefits from risk pooling, but where the moral hazard problems are so insuperable that no private insurer is going to offer it. I give the example of divorce insurance. It'd be great to get insurance against divorce. But then, of course, you would get divorced, right?
Right.
So there's lots of types of insurance that markets won't provide because of moral hazard problems. So who winds up providing them? Well, government, in its role as insurer of last resort. And so a lot of the social safety net and of government social programs are insurance products, and the reason government's providing them is because markets are failing to provide them. And then, what do you know? There's all kinds of moral hazard problems that are associated with them, right? But it's not because government doesn't believe in personal responsibility, and it's not because government is somehow uniquely capable of promoting moral hazard. It's because of the moral hazard that government's doing it in the first place. So I think the personal responsibility idea and that government somehow undermines it is mistaken on two fronts. First of all, it's not government that undermines it. It's insurance that undermines personal responsibility. And that's just, tough luck. Like, welcome to the 21st century. Welcome to the 20th century, right? Like, old-fashioned 19th century, you made your bed, you lie in it, is so far gone. Partly because people have discovered the massive efficiency gains that come from insurance, right? Like, if you look at the way the current credit crisis is being resolved, no one's worried about the moral hazard effects. People are kind of abstractly worried about the moral hazard effects, but in reality,
are worried about. I'm worried about the moral hazard effects.
But day to day, there was a time like back last August where people were a little bit concerned about it, but now everyone is like, "Oh my God, the entire system's collapsing. Let's fix it, and then we'll worry about the moral hazard effects." Right? Yeah. So, there are huge benefits from having the systems in place that function. To pool certain kinds of risks, to have credit markets that function, and so forth. And right now, people are trying to get those systems functioning. There's an abstract concern about moral hazard. But if you want to be like punctilious about it, like, oh, you're responsible, now you have to live with it, you're not going to be able to fix, say, the banking system. So that kind of concern about personal responsibility is just incompatible with the way modern capitalism functions. And so I think that a lot of the right-wing rhetoric on personal responsibility just kind of unfairly picks on government and unfairly picks on poor people without recognizing that this is just a generic feature of modern societies, dependent as they are on insurance systems. Okay.
I agree. People don't. If you were to see the extended family as an insurance scheme, you don't hear a lot of right-wingers saying, the problem is that people can depend on their families,
right.
To bail them out of a bind. But again, there's a question about what the best scope is for risk pooling, and there are things that the government can and can't do well, and there is a certain kind of crowding out that can happen in risk pooling. That you actually see in the history of the 20th century, where there already were lots of mutual aid societies at the beginning of the 20th century in the United States, probably I'm sure in Canada, where people were buying policies into these sort of like social insurance schemes. You pay your membership. It's like being a member of a union. You pay your membership dues. If you fall ill, then then the Friendly Society or the Mutual Aid Society helps cover your medical bills or whatever. There's a lot of ways in which churches do this now. The Mormons have a pretty robust social safety net among their members, and one of the efficiencies that you get from something like a smaller community-based sort of form of mutual aid is that you can do a better job of policing shirkers. You can do a better job of monitoring to make sure that people aren't free riding, so that people aren't taking advantage of the insurance to act especially stupid simply because they're insured. And so sometimes when the scale of the insurer is the club of everyone, it really does increase the chance of moral hazard when the monitoring mechanisms become so diffuse that there's just nothing you can do about it. So you really do need the argument when you're doing this sort of comparative analysis that there's something about the structure of a government, something about its sort of ability to coerce that allows it to pool risk and to insure in a way that, and again, it might be misleading to think of it as a market, but there are sort of voluntary ways of pooling risk and insuring people against harmful events, and so it's not really the market that's doing that. It's simply sort of voluntary behavior. And one of the things that your book actually raised in my mind, which is I think a really fascinating, it's not a paradox exactly, but I don't think people have gotten their heads around this, is that when the ability of civil society to put together voluntary associations that deal with some of these problems, when you have a high level of trust and social cohesion, that's also when government works well. Right, so government works well when you have a high level of trust and social cohesion. So when you have the conditions of cooperativeness under which government's going to do a good job at providing things efficiently, you've also got the conditions where it's probably least necessary for the government to provide things, and vice versa. When you have the conditions under which people can provide things voluntarily, the government can probably be pretty efficient in providing them. And I feel like people on both sides of the equation don't get how this kind of ethos of cooperativeness is the sort of underpinning to all these different institutions.
Yeah, there is this view that criticizes the state for crowding out various spontaneous forms of cooperation, and there are cases in which that no doubt occurs. But, I mean, insurance is a kind of interesting example. Weirdly, I have an academic interest in the subject, so I've read a lot of stuff on 19th century insurance and exactly what led to the breakdown of the friendly societies, and in particular the role that actuarial science played in it. There's one of my favorite books that almost no one's read in North America is this book by François Evald called L'État-providence. It's only available in French, and it will never be translated because it's about 700 pages. It's just called The Welfare State. But what he argues is that the whole story of the welfare state actually needs to be understood in terms of the rise of the insurance industry in the 19th century. All this stuff about class conflict and distribution is totally barking up the wrong tree. It's all about insurance. But what happened in the 19th century was it's not government that crowded out friendly societies, and it wasn't adverse selection problems that undermined those friendly societies. It was the rise of an insurance industry based on actuarial science that aggressively courted customers away from friendly societies that created the adverse selection problems. In other words, in the 19th century...
By pricing risk, they were able to sort of poach people off and leave the friendly societies with the uninsurables.
And that's right. And the 19th century literature of this is full of people who are keen on probability theory and actuarial science, criticizing these sort of stupid people for signing up in these level... and being really infuriated by people signing up in these level premium societies when they could be getting much better rates by joining the new actuarially informed insurance companies. And so, I mean, adverse selection, the standard economic model suggests that the customers themselves wind up defecting from these arrangements. But what historically actually happened was that firms would target likely customers and they would draw them away from their insurer. I mean, the same way, we have these ads for like gray power car insurance where they say, over 65, you could be getting way lower rates. And that's exactly what happened in the 19th century. So those friendly societies were undermined by private insurers. But then, of course, those private insurers created the conditions for their own failure. because they generated the adverse selection problem that then started corrosively undermining their own business models. And so the state
That's
typically...
fascinating. Tell me the name of this book again.
It's by François Ewald. It's Ewald, and it's called L'État-providence, which is just French for the welfare state.
L'État-providence. Okay.
And
I'll learn French and read it.
I used to teach at a French university, so I had a chance to teach it a couple times, and I haven't had the opportunity since then. But it's a really neat argument. It's totally overblown because it's French. But he has this idea that essentially the logic of capitalism was demolished and of personal responsibility was demolished in the 19th century by insurance companies, and that the state then arose basically following this logic of insurance. And it's provocative, but I think it's a really supremely interesting and actually pretty informative thesis.
That's fascinating. We'll have to look it up. Well, Joseph, we've gone over our time. It was a fascinating discussion. Thanks for coming on. Your book is Filthy Lucre, Economics for People Who Hate Capitalism. You can buy it on Amazon.ca or American publishers. You're watching. Pick up the book. It's excellent. It deserves a wide readership. So thanks, Joseph. Oh, and by the way, apparently, I'm becoming Canadian next month.
Really?
No, this month. This month. They're changing the citizenship laws, and I will be Canadian because my father was.
Oh, how nice.
Yeah. So, all of a sudden, on the 17th, I'll have a sense of solidarity with you, but not until then.
My mother was American, so I'm looking forward to the day that you guys change your citizen laws.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, man. I'll talk to you soon, I hope.